Greetings ladies and gentlefish, and welcome to a video that I've been asked to do, basically just quickly talking about different ammunition types. Now I have brushed on this topic in previous videos, but they're a little bit old now, so I thought, what the hell. This is going to be mainly a talky video. If you want some examples of using different types of ammunition, I guess just go and look at some of the gameplay videos that I have posted. But basically, I'm just going to be talking about the different types of ammo available in the game and when and where to use them. Now, this should come with a big fat caveat that there is no way I'm going to be able to tell you every different nuance of when you should or shouldn't use different ammunition types. Essentially, you're just going to have to try things out and learn from experience, so this is only going to be very general guidelines. Other big caveat, this is mainly, if this is of use to people, I imagine it's going to be primarily of use to those who are either new to the game, starting out in the game, or at that kind of level. My point is not an advanced player, if you will. If you're really good at the game, you, I imagine, already know everything I'm about to say. So, with that in mind, let's start with the basics. Okay, first thing to bear in mind. Obviously, you have different guns in the game, and each of them have slightly different specialities, things they're good at, things they aren't, and there are a whole bunch of different characteristics associated with a gun that define how much damage you're going to do to your target, before we even factor in how skilled you are as a player and how good you are with weak spot knowledge and all of that jazz. But all of that set aside, there are, let me think for a moment, around about 5 ammunition types in the game. I say around about because it really depends how you define it. The game massively simplifies the ammunition available to tanks compared with how they historically perform and what ammunition they historically have available to them. So as I say, what you get in the game is a vast simplification of that. And the game mechanically breaks the ammunition available to you down into, what, 4 different ammo types? Sort of 5? But I'll get to that when I get to that. So, the first and the most common type of ammunition is your bog standard armor-piercing round. This is essentially your gun firing a solid projectile, close as damn it, at the target. Projectile hits target, projectile penetrates armor, projectile does damage, primarily based upon the kinetic energy of the projectile, its caliber, and, you know, how much, what you hit, basically, with that projectile. Now, in the game, this is the most common type of ammunition available. This is generally your standard ammunition that you're going to be firing most of the time. It's your go-to ammo if you're not sure what else to fire at a target. Let's just bring up, for example, the 122mm gun here on the 112, and you can see that it's armor-piercing ammunition is the first type of ammunition mentioned here. So when you look at the gun stats of a particular gun, you'll see caliber, rate of fire, and then you'll see 3, usually 3, sometimes 2, occasionally 1, different average penetration and average damage values. And each of these values corresponds to each of the ammunition types available to that gun. Now, these are average values, and these are also assuming an engagement range of 100 meters. So bear those qualifiers in mind. But if we have a look at this, you can see down here compatible shells, armor piercing, high explosive anti-tank, and high explosive. And here we are with our armor piercing rounds: 175 average damage, 175 average penetration, 390 average damage. So this is your bog standard type of armor piercing round. When one of these rounds hits the target, you get what's known as a normalization roll. Firstly, essentially, all of these rounds are shaped such that when they hit the target, they slightly reduce the angle between the shell and the normal direction to the target, i.e. they slightly decrease the any effective angling of the armor that you are shooting at. That is what they are designed to do. That is one of the reasons why armor-piercing rounds are generally shaped, and that is called your normalization. And in the case of armor-piercing rounds, I believe it's 5 degrees. I'm not going to go into that in much detail. My point here is simply that armor-piercing rounds negate a certain amount of the angling of a bit of armor that you are shooting at. So let's imagine that you were shooting here at the 112 and your shot hit the upper front plate. You can see the upper front plate here is presented at quite a reclined angle. Armor piercing rounds, when it strike it, will position themselves such that they take off a little bit of the effective angling of that armor plate, which is a good thing. And in the case of armor piercing rounds, I believe it's 5 degrees. So they are your bog standard rounds. Generally speaking, when you have a tank, they will have access to 3 types of ammunition. One of those types is almost invariably an armor piercing round, and it's your, as I say, your go-to round for everyday situations. Generally speaking, you also have access to 2 other types of ammunition: high explosive and some form of what is usually referred to as premium ammunition. Now, if we go to the service tab on this tank, you'll notice the main difference here. Armor piercing rounds in this particular example are just over 1,000 credits per shot. Your high explosive rounds, more on those in a minute, are just over 600 credits a shot, and your premium ammunition, in this case high explosive anti-tank, is 5,600 credits a shot. So your quote-unquote premium ammo is considerably more expensive than your other types of ammunition. As I say, I will get onto that more in a moment. So you can see here that with the 112 we've got the 175 average penetration, remembering of course that in the game that can vary by as much as 25% in either direction. So do bear that in mind. You're not always going to penetrate 175mm of armor. Sometimes your shell would go through more, sometimes you would go through less, and before any of you start complaining that makes no sense, it does make sense in as much as in the real world there are a lot of factors that would affect how your shell travels in the air, how well it will penetrate its target, that it would be far too complicated to try and model in a game. So you just have some statistical way of kind of incorporating all that, and in this case it's, you know, the RNG, the random number generator, on the shell, allowing the penetration to vary by as much as 25% one way or the other. So that's armor piercing rounds, your bog standard, boring rounds. Second main type of ammunition is high explosive. Again, if we have a look over here, high explosive is the third ammunition type to be listed, and we can see essentially your high explosive rounds, A, do more damage, providing they penetrate, B, have less penetration. And so this is giving you an idea of one of the main ways in which you can use them. If you come across an incredibly weakly armored target and you have a high explosive shell loaded, you can potentially do more damage to that target every time you pull the trigger, which is good. So let's imagine, for example, I was driving around in my 112 and I came across an AMX CDC, if I can ever find the darn thing. This is the problem with having way too many tanks in your garage. There we go, AMX CDC. This thing is a very lightly armoured French medium tank, and if we have a look at the stats, we can see that in the garage it tells me at best it has 30mm of armour from the front. I have 61 average penetration with my HE round, so if I have a reasonable chance of penetrating this high explosive round, and if I penetrate it, then I can do a lot of damage to my target. So that's the first quality of a HE round to bear in mind. Second quality of a HE round, it's called high explosive, which means it explodes. And so there will be an explosion radius associated with that HE round. And so again, if we go back to my 112, if we look at the service tab here, we can see that my burst radius on the high explosive shells is listed as 2.49 meters. This means that my high explosive shells explode when they hit a target, and the radius of that explosion is 2.49 meters. So basically you get an explosion that's 5 meters from one side to the other. Close enough. What this means is that you don't actually have to hit your target with a HE shell to do some damage. You could get a near miss and it would still do some damage, potentially, to the target. Now, one thing to bear in mind here is that very small caliber guns have such a small explosion radius that you will very rarely ever notice it. Larger caliber guns get a larger explosion radius. The ones that are most notable here are artillery, for example, getting a very large, potentially, explosion radius with their HE shells. What this also means is that if you hit a target but do not penetrate it, then your HE shell will explode on the point of impact, and that explosion will do some damage, or will usually do some damage to the target, depending on how thick the target's armor is, where you've hit them, etc, etc, etc. But it means that HE shells are a pretty good choice if you just want to do a little bit of damage to your target, and you want to do that little bit of damage reliably. So, sort of situations in which it can be useful. Perhaps you really need to reset someone who's sitting in the capture circle, throw a HE shell at them, you do 2 points of damage, maybe, but that 2 points is enough to get the reset, that's all you're after. Or maybe you're facing a very heavily armoured tank, but they're only on a couple of hit points. Load up the HE shell, derp them to death. Voila. The other property that I want to mention, of course, that's related to these two things with a high explosive shell is because this shell physically explodes rather than purely relying upon caliber and kinetic energy to do its damage, it means that you can do quite a lot of module damage with high explosive shells. Even if you don't penetrate, you can knock out modules, and if you do penetrate, well, you've got like a, in this case, 122mm shell that's going to explode inside the tank, and strangely enough, that's going to give the crew a significant emotional experience, and it's not going to be for their best. So, with HE shells, you can do quite a lot of damage. The final property of HE shells that's probably worth mentioning is that they do not lose penetration with range. So generally speaking, if you're firing your regular armor-piercing rounds, this 175 average penetration, I mentioned that this is assuming an engagement distance of 100 meters. The further and further away you engage your target, the more energy your shell loses as it travels, and so the effective penetration falls off with range. HE shells do not get that because they're not relying on the kinetic energy of the shell to penetrate in the first place. They're relying on going boom in someone's face, and it doesn't matter how far away someone is, the shell is still going to go boom. One last thing worth mentioning, I guess, about HE shells is that they do not get any overmatching. If you don't know what overmatching is, go and look at the World of Tanks wiki. In short, overmatching allows a very large caliber gun to punch through very thin, well-angled armor. You know, it's basically trying to represent the fact that it doesn't matter how much you angle a piece of paper, a big fat anti-tank gun is still going to make a mess of it. HE shells do not benefit from that, so do bear that in mind. HE shells are also typically one of the cheapest types of ammunition available to you. Again, let's go back to my 112 ammunition types. 1,000 credits a shot, or just over, for an armor-piercing shell, but only 608 for a HE shell. This means that if you use HE shells effectively and intelligently, you can do more damage and cost yourself fewer credits while doing so. So, as I say, when do you want to use HE shells? Generally speaking, either A, against very, very thinly armoured targets, or B, against very, very heavily armoured targets that you can't reliably do damage to with your armour-piercing shells, and you still want to do some damage with them. Now, that's your two of your main ammunition types. Let's quickly... no, before moving on, I will quickly say, if you're using HE shells, do be very careful. Let's imagine, for example, you fire an armor-piercing shell at someone and it hits their tracks. There's a very good chance that you'll damage the tracks, but the shell will still have the kinetic energy to keep passing on through, hit their tank, go through their tank, damage their tank, etc, etc. Everything is grand. With a HE shell, it merely explodes on the point of contact, so if it hits, say for example, the suspension, it will hit the suspension, do damage to the suspension as it explodes, but it will not penetrate the hull of the target's tank. Therefore, you can get situations where you think to yourself, I swear the armor there is thin enough for me to penetrate with my HE shell, but as it turns out, your shell just hits a bit of track or something and explodes on the point of contact, and you don't do your full damage. There are some guns in the game, we're talking howitzers here, generally speaking, short-barreled, low-velocity guns that are really designed to fire HE at people. They get very effective high explosive rounds. and can do an awful lot of damage. The KV-2 is a good example. At the other extreme, you get tanks which have such small guns for their tier that it's not even worth bothering with high explosive. Here, for example, is the 5916. It's a light tank. If we look at the 57mm gun here, you can see that by going from armor piercing, first shell type here, to high explosive, your penetration goes from 112 to 29. 29 is tier 1 levels of penetration, and there are very few tanks this machine will meet that it can do anything to with 29mm of penetration, and if you even do bother to load them up, you only get an extra 10 average damage per shot. So there are some guns, very small caliber ones, on which it's not even worth bothering with HE, but generally speaking, most tanks, most situations, I would recommend a couple of rounds of high explosive here and there. Third ammunition type, armor piercing composite rigid. Well, that's how it's known in the game. There's a variety of different examples of this ammo in real life. Essentially, the idea is that you take a regular armor piercing shell and you put a very small dart inside. And when you fire this shell, or what I'm actually describing, to be fair, is armor piercing discarding sabot, but I'm not going to get into the technicalities. Basically, when you fire the shell, you have the propellant associated with a shell of that caliber. So, say for example, look at the Conqueror, you have the propellant associated with a 120mm gun, so that gives you more space for more propellant compared with a lower caliber gun, but once the shell is in the air, the casing falls away to reveal this small dart. The dart has been given the propellant, the punch, the velocity of the 120mm gun, but it's a much smaller object itself with a much finer point, and so it is much better at penetrating armor. It takes all that energy and concentrates it into that small point right at the end. And so it makes the rounds good at penetrating armor, essentially. In most cases, this type of ammunition is a type of what's known as premium ammunition. So, i.e. it costs more. Let's have a look at our Conqueror, for example. Standard shell price of armor piercing, just over 1,000 credits. Your HE rounds on this are actually 1,200 credits. They're a bit more expensive, but never mind. Your APCR is 4,400 credits. If we have a look at the stats for the gun, we can see that armor piercing, you get 259mm of penetration and 400 average damage. APCR, the damage stays the same, but the penetration goes up to 326. Generally speaking, APCR rounds come with much higher penetration, and so if you are really struggling to penetrate a target, you can switch to your APCR rounds and you will have a better chance of penetrating your target. As it stands, there are two disadvantages associated with APCR rounds, and, well, okay, there are two big advantages and a couple of disadvantages. Big advantage: one, as I've already mentioned, you get more penetration. Two, generally speaking, you get a higher shell velocity than armor piercing. The dart travels faster, and so it's easier to predict leads and things like that. Disadvantages: one, you get less normalization than armor piercing rounds. What this means in practice is that if you were to take an armor piercing round and an APCR round and they had the same penetration values, your armor piercing round will penetrate armor more effectively. And so the much higher penetration on your APCR round is mitigated slightly by this reduced normalization. So do bear that in mind. Even so, usually the difference between armor piercing and APCR rounds is enough to penetrate more reliably, even with that said. The other thing to bear in mind with APCR rounds is that they lose penetration with distance faster than an armor piercing round. But again, the higher penetration in the first place tends to make up for that. And so in most of the time, APCR rounds are just flat out better than armor piercing rounds. But they are more expensive, generally speaking, and so they cost you more money. Thirdly, high explosive anti-tank. So let's go back to my 112. The idea of high explosive anti-tank ammo is that you have a shell, it hits its target, it injects superheated metal straight through the target, through the armor of the target, and this metal splashes everything on the inside. again, it's an unpleasant experience for your crew. So don't let the high explosive bit of a high explosive anti-tank shell fool you. In context of game mechanics, it functions more like an armor piercing shell than it does a high explosive shell. It doesn't explode, for example. Generally speaking, the advantages of a heat round, and we can demonstrate this if we look at our 112 again, are the much higher penetration than the corresponding armor piercing round. Here we go from 175 with armor piercing to 250 with heat. Disadvantages: often heat rounds tend to have quite low shell velocity. They are also get no normalization, I don't think, or much reduced normalization, I can't remember which. So again, this means if you were to take an armor piercing round and a heat round with the same penetration values, the armor piercing round would actually be better at penetrating armor. Finally, like high explosive rounds, they tend to just release their metallic penetrator, however you want to phrase it, on the first surface that they hit. What this means in practice is that they are quite easily defeated by spaced armor or things in the way like suspension. So basically, heat rounds are most effective against flat, armoured surfaces with no spaced armour. They are less effective against anything with spaced armour. So for example, the Super Pershing from the front is a nightmare to fire high explosive anti-tank rounds at, because this is all spaced armour. The Super Pershing just giggles. And again, I don't believe you get overmatching with high explosive anti-tank ammunition. They are the main types of ammo in the game. There is kind of one other sort of ammunition in the game: high explosive squash head. This is mainly a feature of British tanks. I'm actually going to get the Centurion Mark 7 for this. Now, historically, the Brits like their high HESH rounds, and HESH rounds work well with rifled guns, and it means that the British guns in the real world are a bit funky. In terms of the game, however, high explosive squash head rounds are treated exactly the same as high explosive rounds, they're just given higher penetration. So let's take a look at the Centurion 7/1, for example. It gets 3 types of ammunition, APCR, and 2 types of HESH ammo. And I'm just going to compare this with the, once I've found it, M46 pattern, wherever I've put it, or the M48 pattern. That'll do fine. So if we compare, these 2 types of ammo, here is the pattern on the left hand side, the stats for the pattern's guns, and on the right hand side we're going to take the stats for the Centurion gun. These are both very comparable 105mm guns. If we look at the high explosive rounds on the pattern, you get 480 alpha damage and 53 penetration. If you look at the HESH round on the Centurion, you get 480 alpha damage, same caliber gun, but 105mm of penetration. And this is the reason the Conqueror's high explosive round was more expensive when we looked at it earlier on. It's a high explosive squash head round, which in game terms means it's a HE round with more pen. Some of the British tanks also get a premium version of this HE round, which gets even more pen. So you can see here with the Centurion, its premium round is actually 210mm of penetration on a high explosive round, making it very good at killing relatively lightly armoured targets. But these are, I didn't want to really refer to this as a different ammo type, because in the context of the game it's just treated as high explosive with higher penetration values. Generally speaking, you can talk. There are some tanks, for example, that don't get armor piercing rounds. There are some tanks that only fire certain types of ammunition to be associated with certain guns. I'm not going to get into that too much. The general rule of thumb is use armor piercing ammo where and when you can, as your default ammo type. If you meet a target that is very thinly armored, switch to high explosive. If you meet a target that is very thickly armoured and you can't reliably penetrate with your armour piercing rounds, either switch to high explosive to do a little bit of damage to them, or switch to either APCR or heat ammo to have much higher penetration and still try and get your full damage out of your shell at the expense of spending more credits. That's a kind of rule of thumb. The caveat here is really, in order to make the best use of your ammunition, you need to know how effective the armor of your target is against the ammunition you are firing at it. And for that, there is no substitute for, one, going and looking at a website like tanks.gg and looking at the armor profile of different vehicles, and two, going out there and experimenting for yourself. I can sit here and witter on all day, but you need to gain that experience yourself with different machines against different targets. There's, like many things in life, there is no substitute for raw experience at these things. I think that's all I really wanted to say on the subject of ammunition. I hope I haven't laboured the point too much. Like I say, general rule of thumb, armor piercing are the rounds you should be using most of the time. If you can't penetrate, if you can penetrate a target very easily, i.e. it is incredibly thinly armoured, switch to high explosive rounds. And if it's incredibly thickly armoured, i.e. high explosive, or your so-called premium ammunition, or alternatively, if your tank has some mobility, go somewhere and shoot it in the side. The fewer times you have to shoot premium ammunition at something, the more money you will make. It's as simple as that. So if you're struggling to make money in this game, try and make better use of your high explosive and your armor piercing rounds where possible. Now, you need to be a little bit careful. I'm just going to give you one example from my own experience. I was driving the Super Pershing. I've got the Super Pershing somewhere. Super Pershing is a tier 8 premium tank with a 90mm gun. Just bring the gun up here. You'll notice the HE rounds get 45mm of penetration. And I came up against an AMX CDC. AMX CDC has 30mm of armor. I loaded my HE to penetrate this guy. However, he only ever really gave me shots at the front of his turret, which is well angled, and there's a gun mantler in the way. I was never actually going to penetrate that with HE rounds, and so I ended up doing a couple of splashes for small amounts of damage, whereas I could have penetrated him reliably with my AP rounds, and as a result, I died instead of getting the kill. So, use high explosive in these different types of ammunition with caution. Be aware of what you can and cannot penetrate. Targets that you can often penetrate at various different tiers. At tier 5 you have the T-67, tier 5 American tank destroyer, which is pretty lightly armoured. At tier 6 you've got the Hellcat, M18 Hellcat, another very lightly armoured tank if you can shoot it in the hull. These are pretty good HE round targets. At tier 7, for example, you have, no, not the British, I'm looking for the Americans, you have the Scorpion with 1mm of armour. If you ever meet this thing, just load high explosive and murder him. One last thing I will bear in mind. When saying all of this, obviously you have to be careful about using the right ammunition type against the right target. Armor piercing will work against most targets. There is nothing more frustrating, or there are a few things more frustrating than seeing a lightly armoured target, loading high explosive for them, and then coming against someone else, firing your HE and doing very little damage. You'd have been better off with an armor piercing round. So, only load that HE if you are sure the next target you are going to be shooting at will benefit from you using that HE, if that makes sense. If you have a really long reload with your gun, then you're going to regret loading a very specialized type of ammunition for a very specialized situation and then not finding that situation. If you're not sure what target you're going to be shooting at next, armor piercing is a good generic round to use against pretty much everyone. If you want examples of using different types of ammo, by all means go and check out some of the gameplay videos that I have uploaded at various points and that I will continue to upload. I'm sure you'll see examples of using different types of ammo there. So, with all that said, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know it was a talky video, but I hope it was useful, especially for those people who are requesting a quick little a video on the subject of different types of ammunition. Again, there really is no substitute for you just going and experimenting yourself and seeing what works and what doesn't. So yes, I hope you guys enjoyed or found it informative. If you did, by all means feel free to catch some of my other videos and or subscribe to my channel, and I wish you very happy hunting on that battlefield. Ciao ciao.